The Prince and the Baker's Daughter. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage. Prince Adrian stood on the marble balcony of his tower, gazing out over the kingdom that would one day be his. Below him stretched manicured gardens, where peacocks wandered freely among fountains carved from precious stone. Beyond the palace walls, the village bustled with life merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets, smoke rising from countless chimneys where families gathered for their evening meals. He should have felt proud, perhaps even content. After all, everything his eyes could see would someday belong to him. The treasury overflowed with gold. His chambers housed artwork that kingdoms had warred over. His wardrobe contained silks from the Far East. His table bore delicacies from every corner of the known world. Servants anticipated his every need before he could even voice it. Yet as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Adrian felt nothing but a hollow ache in his chest. The beauty before him might as well have been a painting, something to observe, but never truly touch. He gripped the balcony's ornate railing, his knuckles white against the gold inlay, and wondered when everything he'd been given had begun to feel like bars of the most elegant prison ever constructed. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Your Highness," came the gentle voice of Thomas, his personal attendant. "The evening feast is prepared. Your parents await you in the great hall." Adrian didn't turn around. "Tell me, Thomas," he said quietly, "when you return to your quarters each night, do you feel anything?" The older man paused, clearly puzzled by the question. Yes, Your Highness. Tired, usually. Sometimes satisfied if the day has gone well. Grateful for my bed, and perhaps a bit of bread and cheese." "Grateful," Adrian repeated the word, as if tasting something foreign. When was the last time he had felt grateful for anything? When had he last felt the simple satisfaction Thomas described? He couldn't remember. "Shall I tell their majesties you'll be delayed?" Thomas asked gently. Adrian finally turned from the balcony, his young face bearing the weight of someone far older. "No," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I'll come, though I suspect tonight's feast will taste just as flavorless as yesterday's, and tomorrow's will be the same." As he walked toward the door, Adrian caught his reflection in the polished surface of a golden mirror. A handsome prince stared back one, who had everything and felt nothing. The irony wasn't lost on him that, in a palace filled with countless mirrors, he had never felt less able to recognize the person looking back. Thomas waited patiently as Adrian lingered, studying his own face as if searching for some spark of the boy he once was. When had his eyes become so dull? When had his smile, the one that graced portraits and charmed visiting dignitaries, become nothing more than a practiced expression, worn like another piece of royal regalia? "Your Highness," Thomas ventured gently, "if I may, you seem particularly troubled this evening." Adrian let out a bitter laugh. "Troubled? How can one be troubled when surrounded by such splendor?" He gestured broadly at his chambers, at the silk curtains that cost more than most families earned in a year, at the jeweled goblets that had never known thirst, at the books bound in leather and gold that he'd never found reason to open. "Perhaps," Thomas said carefully, "splendor is not the cure for every ailment." The words hung in the air between them, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but a recognition that someone else might understand his peculiar suffering. He turned from the mirror to study his attendant's weathered face, seeing wisdom there that no amount of royal education had provided him. "Tell me truthfully, Thomas," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think me mad, to feel such emptiness when I have been given everything a man could desire?" Thomas considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I think, Your Highness, that a garden given only water and no soil will produce the most beautiful flowers, but they will have no roots, and the first strong wind will scatter them to nothing." The metaphor struck Adrian like a physical blow. Beautiful, but rootless. Was that what he had become? A flower cultivated in luxury, but never allowed to sink deep enough into real earth to find sustenance that might last? Before he could respond, the distant sound of trumpets echoed through the palace corridors, announcing the evening meal. The familiar melody that once excited him now sounded like a funeral dirge, marking another day passed without meaning, another evening to endure rather than enjoy. "Come then," Adrian said, straightening his shoulders with practiced royal bearing. "Let us go pretend that tonight's feast will be different from all the others." Chapter 2. The Royal Concern. The great hall stretched before Adrian like a cathedral of excess, its vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of celestial abundance. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across tables laden with roasted peacock, honeyed fruits from distant lands, and wines that had aged longer than most of his subjects had lived. The aroma should have been intoxicating, but Adrian barely noticed it as he took his place at the high table between his parents. King Edmund watched his son with barely concealed worry, noting how Adrian's fork pushed the delicate quail around his golden plate without taking a single bite. The prince's posture was perfect. Years of royal training had seen to that, but his spirit seemed absent, as if only an elegant shell of himself had come to dinner. "The musicians are particularly skilled tonight," Queen Isabella offered, nodding toward the quartet playing a lilting melody near the great hearth. "Master Giovanni brought them all the way from the Venetian court." Adrian glanced toward the musicians with polite acknowledgement, but said nothing. One of them, a young woman with dancing fingers on the lute, caught his eye and smiled hopefully. Her talent was undeniable, her music beautiful enough to move hearts, but Adrian felt his own heart remain stubbornly unmoved. "Perhaps you'd like to hear them play something specific," the queen pressed gently, her maternal instinct sensing her son's need for engagement. "It matters little," Adrian replied, his voice carrying none of the rudeness of dismissal, only a profound weariness. "One song sounds much the same as another when you hear them played for you rather than with you." King Edmund exchanged a meaningful look with his wife. They had hoped tonight might be different, that the elaborate feast and entertainment might kindle some spark in their son's eyes. Instead, they watched him methodically cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it, like a man going through the motions of living without actually participating in life. "Son," the king said, setting down his wine goblet with a gentle clink against the table, "your mother and I have been concerned." Adrian looked up, meeting his father's eyes for the first time that evening. "Concerned? About what, exactly?" "About you," Queen Isabella said softly, her voice carrying the ache that only a mother's love could hold. "You have everything any young man could dream of. Yet you seem—" She searched for words that wouldn't wound. "Unreachable. As if you're slowly disappearing before our eyes." The honesty of her words cut through Adrian's practiced composure. For a moment, his careful mask slipped, revealing the lost young man beneath the princely exterior. Around them, courtiers continued their conversations and laughter, oblivious to the quiet crisis unfolding at the high table. "I don't know how to explain it," Adrian admitted, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the feast. "It's as if I'm drowning in everything I've been given, but dying of thirst at the same time." The king reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over his son's. "Then, perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time we stopped giving you things and started helping you find what you truly need." Adrian stared down at his father's hand scarred from years of swordplay in his youth, calloused from actually working alongside his people when the kingdom faced hardship. These were hands that had known purpose, struggle, genuine accomplishment. Adrian's own hands were soft, unmarked by any real effort or meaningful work. But what if I don't know what I need? Adrian asked, his voice cracking slightly. What if 23 years of having everything has made me incapable of wanting anything real? Queen Isabella's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She had watched her son transform from a curious, laughing child into this hollow young man, and she blamed herself for every gift that had failed to bring him lasting joy, every comfort that had somehow robbed him of the ability to find satisfaction. "Do you remember," she said softly, "when you were 7 years old, you spent an entire afternoon in the kitchen gardens with old Henrik, the groundskeeper? You came back covered in dirt, proudly holding 3 small carrots you'd helped pull from the earth." Adrian's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something almost like warmth crossing his features. "I remember. I insisted Cook prepare them for dinner, even though they were barely bigger than my thumb." "You ate every bite," the king added, a sad smile playing at his lips. "You said they were the most delicious carrots in the world because you had helped them grow." "When did we stop letting you get your hands dirty?" the queen wondered aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. "When did we decide that a prince should never know the satisfaction of earned accomplishment?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. Around them, the feast continued its elaborate dance servants, refilling wine goblets, courtiers laughing at jests they'd heard a dozen times before, the musicians playing their practiced perfection. But at the high table, a family was finally naming the poison that had been slowly killing their son's soul. "I've been thinking," Adrian said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening, "about making a change, about finding something, anything that might make me feel alive again." Both parents leaned forward, hope flickering in their eyes like candle flames in a draught. "What kind of change?" the king asked, though his tone suggested he would support almost anything that might restore his son's lost vitality. Adrian looked around the great hall, taking in the opulent display, the scripted entertainment, the predictable luxury that surrounded him like a beautiful prison. When he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that had been absent for years. "Something that terrifies me," he said simply, because fear, at least, would be feeling something. Chapter 3. A Desperate Proclamation. 3 days later, the palace courtyard buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Word had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Prince Adrian had called for a public assembly, something unheard of in recent memory. Merchants abandoned their stalls, farmers left their fields, and nobles postponed their morning hunts, all drawn by curiosity about what could possibly compel the reclusive prince to address his people directly. Adrian stood before the great doors of the palace, looking out at the sea of faces gathered below the marble steps. His parents flanked him, their expressions carefully composed despite the anxiety they felt about their son's mysterious plan. He had refused to tell them the details, saying only that it was something he needed to do alone, something that required the kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The crowd stretched from the palace gates to the fountain in the center of the square, peasants in rough-spun wool standing shoulder to shoulder with merchants in fine linen, children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view, elderly women whispering prayers that their prince might finally find whatever he was searching for. Adrian had never seen so many of his subjects in one place, had never felt the weight of so many eyes upon him with genuine interest rather than mere ceremonial obligation. "My people," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the tremor he felt in his chest. "I stand before you today not as your future king, but as a man in desperate need of something I cannot name." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the formal, distant tone they expected from royal proclamations. This was raw, honest, vulnerable in a way that made even the most hardened soldiers lean forward to catch every word. "For 23 years I have been given every comfort, every luxury, every pleasure this kingdom can provide. Adrian continued, his hands clasped behind his back. Yet I stand before you as empty as a well that has run dry. I have forgotten how to feel joy, how to find wonder, how to truly live rather than simply exist. In the crowd, a baker's daughter named Elena found herself pressing closer, her heart unexpectedly stirring at the prince's honesty. She had expected arrogance, perhaps a demand for higher taxes or military conscription. Instead, she heard the voice of someone drowning in plain sight, and something deep in her chest responded to his pain. My parents, in their wisdom and love, have given me their blessing to seek what I cannot find within these palace walls, Adrian said, gesturing toward the king and queen, who nodded their support despite their obvious concern. Therefore, I make this proclamation to you all. I will marry the woman who can bring true joy back into my life. The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Young women throughout the square began whispering to their mothers, calculating their chances, wondering what exactly the prince meant by true joy. Some were already mentally cataloging their finest dresses, their most impressive accomplishments, their family's assets that might catch royal attention. But Adrian raised his hand for silence, and something in his expression suggested there was more to this unusual proposal than a simple courtship. I do not seek wealth, for I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, he said firmly. I do not seek beauty alone, for I am surrounded by beautiful things that have lost all meaning. I do not seek entertainment, for I have been entertained to the point of numbness. What I seek is something I cannot define, something I will recognize only when I feel it. The return of wonder, of purpose, of the ability to care deeply about anything at all. Near the fountain, Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Unlike the other women around her who were already planning their approaches, she found herself genuinely worried for this young man, who seemed to be offering his entire future to strangers, desperately hoping one of them might save him from a fate worse than death. A life without meaning. Any woman in this kingdom, regardless of birth or station, may present herself at the palace gates, Adrian announced. I ask only that you come not with gifts or performances designed to impress, but with whatever you believe might kindle the spark of life in a soul that has forgotten how to burn. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, seeing hope and calculation and curiosity reflected back at him. For the first time in months, he felt something resembling anticipation, though it was tinged with a terror that made his knees weak. I place my happiness in your hands, he concluded, his voice carrying a note of desperate prayer. May one of you succeed where everything else has failed. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and possibility, Elena remained by the fountain, staring up at the prince as he turned to re-enter the palace. She had no fine dresses, no impressive talents, no family connections that might recommend her. But something in his words had reached her heart, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she found herself already planning to accept his impossible challenge. Chapter 4. The First Suitors. By the following morning, a line of carriages stretched from the palace gates halfway to the village market. Lady Cordelia Ashworth arrived first, her gilded coach pulled by 4 white stallions and accompanied by a retinue of servants carrying silk-wrapped packages. She swept up the palace steps in a gown that cost more than most families earned in several years, her jewelry catching the morning light like captured starlight. Adrian received her in the throne room, sitting rigidly on the ornate chair that felt more like a prison than a seat of power. Lady Cordelia curtsied deeply, then gestured to her servants, who began unveiling their precious cargo with theatrical flourish. Your Highness, she began, her voice cultured and smooth, I bring you pearls from the deepest ocean trenches, harvested by divers who risk their lives for such beauty. The first servant held up a strand of luminous pearls, each one perfectly matched and gleaming. Surely such rare treasures will remind you of the wonders this world contains. Adrian studied the pearls with the detached interest of a scholar examining artifacts. They were indeed beautiful, flawless in their lustrous perfection. He had seen similar pearls in his mother's jewelry collection, had watched them adorn visiting dignitaries and foreign princesses. Their beauty was undeniable, but it stirred nothing within him. "They are magnificent," he said politely, because courtesy demanded it, though his voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting lines from a play he had performed too many times. Encouraged by his response, Lady Cordelia signaled for the next revelation. "And here," she announced dramatically, "a golden chalice crafted by the master smiths of Damascus, inlaid with gems from 7 different kingdoms." The cup blazed in the morning light, filtering through the stained glass windows, a masterpiece of artistry and wealth combined. Adrian nodded appropriately, but inside he felt the familiar deadness creeping over him. Another beautiful object to add to his collection of beautiful objects. Another treasure to sit in a room full of treasures, gathering dust and meaning nothing. The presentation continued for nearly an hour. Rare silks that shimmered like liquid moonlight, exotic spices that filled the air with foreign fragrances, a clockwork bird that sang melodies and spread mechanical wings. Each gift was more elaborate than the last, each one representing extensive planning and enormous expense on Lady Cordelia's part. When the display was complete, she stood before him expectantly, her chin raised with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she truly wanted. "Surely, Your Highness, such wonders must kindle some joy in your heart?" Adrian looked at the assembled treasures, then at Lady Cordelia's hopeful face. She was beautiful, accomplished, wealthy, beyond measure. In every practical sense, she would make an ideal royal bride. Their children would want for nothing. Their kingdom would benefit from the alliance, and she clearly possessed the grace and intelligence befitting a queen. Yet as he sat surrounded by her magnificent gifts, Adrian felt more hollow than before. Each perfect treasure seemed to mock his inability to find joy in perfection, to highlight the fundamental brokenness that no amount of beauty or wealth could repair. "Lady Cordelia," he said gently, rising from his throne, "your gifts are beyond compare, and your thoughtfulness touches me deeply. But I must be honest with you, they do not achieve what we both hoped they might." Her confident smile wavered, confusion flickering in her eyes. "But surely, Your Highness, such rare and beautiful things must—" "They are indeed rare and beautiful," Adrian interrupted softly, "but I fear I am a man who has lost the ability to see beauty as anything more than decoration. These treasures will find honored places in the palace, but they cannot reach the place within me that has forgotten how to feel wonder." Lady Cordelia's face flushed with embarrassment and disappointment. She had been so certain that her approach would succeed, that the sheer magnificence of her offerings would penetrate whatever malady afflicted the prince. The possibility of failure had never seriously entered her mind. I don't understand," she stammered, her composure cracking. "What more could you possibly want than the finest treasures the world has to offer?" Adrian looked at her with genuine sympathy, recognizing in her confusion the same bewilderment he saw in mirrors, the incomprehension of someone who had always believed that having beautiful things and being happy were the same condition. "If I knew the answer to that question, my lady," he said quietly, "I would not need to ask it of others." As Lady Cordelia gathered her gifts and departed in stunned silence, Adrian remained in the throne room, staring at the empty space where her treasures had been displayed. Through the tall windows, he could see other carriages still waiting in the courtyard, other hopeful women preparing their own attempts to solve the riddle of his despair. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what it would feel like to genuinely want something again, to feel his heart quicken with desire or anticipation. But the feeling eluded him like a half-remembered dream, leaving him more convinced than ever that he might be asking the impossible of these women and of himself. Chapter 5. More attempts. Over the following days, the parade of hopeful women continued with increasing desperation and creativity. Each seemed determined to succeed where Lady Cordelia had failed, convinced they understood something about the prince's condition that others had missed. Evangeline Blackwood, daughter of the kingdom's most successful merchant family, arrived with neither treasures nor fanfare, but with an air of intellectual superiority that she wore like armor. She had heard of the prince's rejection of material gifts and believed she had identified the flaw in Lady Cordelia's approach. "Your Highness," she announced as she entered the throne room with purposeful strides, "I come not bearing objects, but offering the gift of knowledge itself." She carried with her a leather satchel filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts. "Surely a mind as refined as yours hungers not for mere possessions, but for the expansion of understanding." Adrian straightened slightly in his throne, curious despite himself. This was, indeed, a different approach, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps intellectual stimulation might reach the places that beauty and luxury could not. Evangeline began to recite poetry in 3 different languages, her voice rich and melodious, as she wove together verses from ancient Greek philosophers, Persian mystics, and contemporary scholars. She spoke of mathematics and astronomy, of the movements of celestial bodies and the hidden patterns that governed all existence. Her knowledge was vast and genuine, her passion for learning unmistakable. "Listen," she said, opening a treatise on natural philosophy, "to how the scholar Ibn Rushd describes the connection between earthly joy and cosmic understanding. The soul finds its truest happiness not in the accumulation of experiences, but in the comprehension of the unity that underlies all things." Adrian listened intently, his analytical mind engaging with her words in a way it hadn't for months. The ideas were fascinating, the scholarship impressive, and Evangeline's enthusiasm was infectious. For nearly 2 hours, she guided him through philosophical arguments and poetic revelations, painting pictures with words of how knowledge could transform suffering into wisdom. Yet even as his mind appreciated the elegance of her presentation, Adrian felt his heart remaining stubbornly unmoved. The philosophy was beautiful in its own way, but it felt like examining a map of a country he would never visit. Intellectually interesting, but emotionally distant. "Your learning is extraordinary, Lady Evangeline," he said when she paused for his response, "and your passion for knowledge is admirable beyond measure. But I find that understanding my condition and feeling differently about it are not the same thing." Her confident expression faltered. "But surely, Your Highness, wisdom is the foundation of contentment. If you understand the nature of joy, does that not lead you closer to experiencing it?" "One would think so," Adrian replied sadly, "but I find myself like a man who can recite every treatise ever written about fire, yet remains cold. The knowledge of warmth is not warmth itself." Before Evangeline could respond, a commotion in the courtyard announced the arrival of the next suitor. Marina Duval, daughter of a celebrated knight, had come with an entirely different strategy. She entered the throne room in practical riding clothes rather than court dress, her hair braided for action rather than adorned for beauty. "Your Highness," she said with a crisp bow rather than a curtsy, "I believe what you lack is not more comfort, but its opposite challenge purpose, the satisfaction that comes only through testing oneself against worthy obstacles." Without waiting for permission, she had her attendants bring in equipment: fencing swords, archery targets, even a chess set carved from jade. "Join me in contests of skill," she challenged, her eyes bright with competitive fire. "Feel your pulse quicken with effort. Taste the salt of earned sweat. Know the rush of victory, hard won." Adrian found himself drawn to his feet, almost against his will. There was something compelling about Marina's direct approach, her assumption that he was capable of more than passive reception of others' offerings. When she handed him a practice sword, his hand closed around the familiar weight of it. He had been trained in swordplay since childhood, though he hadn't touched a blade in years. They dueled in the throne room itself, the ring of steel on steel echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Marina was skilled, and she didn't hold back out of deference to his royal status. She pressed him hard, forcing him to remember reflexes he'd forgotten he possessed, making his muscles burn with unaccustomed effort. For a few minutes, Adrian felt something close to exhilaration. His blood moved faster. His breathing deepened, and the familiar ache of physical exertion was almost pleasant after so many months of listless inactivity. When he managed to score a touch against Marina's shoulder, she laughed with genuine appreciation, and he found himself almost smiling in return. But as the bout ended and his breathing returned to normal, the temporary spark faded like embers without fuel. The physical satisfaction was real but fleeting, and within minutes he felt the familiar weight of emptiness settling over him once again. That was refreshing, he admitted to Marina, who was glowing with the pleasure of a well-matched contest. You are a formidable opponent, and I had forgotten the simple pleasure of physical challenge. Then it worked? Marina asked hopefully, wiping sweat from her brow with the unconscious grace of an athlete. You feel more alive now? Adrian considered the question honestly, searching within himself for any lasting change. For a few moments, yes, he said slowly, but it was like a candle flaring briefly in a windstorm. The light was real, but it could not survive the darkness that surrounds it. Marina's face fell, and Adrian saw in her expression the same confusion that had marked Lady Cordelia's departure. She had been so certain that action and challenge would succeed where passive luxury had failed. As the day wore on, 3 more women tried their various approaches, one with music and dance that was genuinely moving, another with a detailed plan for charitable works that would help the kingdom's poor, and a third with an elaborate garden maze designed to provide mystery and contemplation. Each attempt had merit. Each woman possessed genuine gifts and sincere intentions, yet none could penetrate the strange malady that held Adrian's spirit captive. By evening, as he stood once again on his balcony looking out over his kingdom, Adrian wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps there was no cure for what ailed him. Perhaps he was asking these women to solve a riddle that had no answer, to kindle a fire from ashes that could no longer burn. Chapter 6. The Baker's Daughter Arrives. Weeks after his proclamation, as the morning mist still clung to the palace gardens, Adrian had begun to suspect that his quest was hopeless. From his chamber window, he watched the courtyard below, noting how the line of carriages had dwindled to just a few stragglers. Word had spread throughout the kingdom about the prince's strange affliction and the failure of even the most accomplished women to cure it. Many who had initially planned to try their luck had apparently thought better of it. He was turning away from the window when a lone figure caught his eye, not a carriage or retinue, but a single young woman walking steadily up the winding path toward the palace gates. She wore a simple brown dress, practical and well-mended rather than fashionable, and carried nothing more than a small cloth bundle. Her dark hair was braided back in the manner of working women, and her pace was unhurried, as if she were taking a pleasant morning walk rather than approaching one of the most important moments of her life. Elena had risen before dawn that morning, her hands working the bread dough in her father's bakery, while her mind wrestled with the decision that had kept her awake for days. She had watched from the village as grand carriages passed by, filled with women far more beautiful, wealthy, and accomplished than herself. What could a baker's daughter possibly offer a prince that ladies of the court could not? Yet something about his words during the proclamation had haunted her. She had heard not arrogance or entitlement in his voice, but a pain that resonated with her own understanding of emptiness, though hers came from loss rather than abundance. 3 years earlier, she had nursed her dying mother through a long illness, watching helplessly as someone she loved slipped away despite all her efforts to save them. The grief had taught her about the difference between feeling deeply and feeling nothing at all. Now, as she approached the palace gates, Elena carried with her only what felt true, a single loaf of bread she had baked that morning, still warm and fragrant with herbs from her own small garden. It was humble fare, the kind of simple nourishment she made every day, but it represented something she understood about sustenance that went beyond mere consumption. The guards at the gate looked at her with barely concealed surprise. After weeks of elaborate arrivals and costly displays, this young woman's simplicity was almost shocking. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Marcus, who had served the royal family for 20 years, studied her with curious eyes. "You've come to see the prince?" he asked, his tone not unkind but clearly puzzled. "I have," Elena replied simply, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "And your presentation?" Marcus inquired, looking around for servants or equipment, or anything that might indicate a planned demonstration. Elena lifted the cloth bundle slightly. "Just this, and perhaps a conversation, if His Highness would be willing." Marcus exchanged glances with his fellow guard. They had seen silk-wrapped treasures, scholarly treatises, weapons and musical instruments, elaborate costumes and exotic animals. But a simple loaf of bread? This was either the most foolish attempt yet, or something entirely different from what had come before. "I'll announce you," Marcus said finally, something in Elena's calm demeanor convincing him that she deserved the same courtesy afforded to the noble ladies. "What name shall I give?" "Elena Hartwell, daughter of Master Baker Thomas." As the guard disappeared into the palace, Elena stood quietly in the courtyard, taking in the grandeur around her with appreciative but unawed eyes. She had expected to feel overwhelmed by the marble columns and golden decorations, but instead, she found herself noticing details others might miss: the careful craftsmanship in the stone carvings, the way the morning light transformed the fountain into something magical, the fact that even in this place of ultimate luxury, sparrows still nested in the eaves and went about their simple business of living. When Thomas, the prince's personal attendant, came to escort her inside, he found her sitting on the edge of the fountain, watching the sparrows with genuine interest. There was something about her stillness, her contentment with simply observing, that struck him as unusual after weeks of witnessing increasingly frantic attempts to impress. "Miss Hartwell?" he inquired politely. Elena rose gracefully, brushing a few drops of fountain spray from her skirt. "Yes. Is His Highness ready to see me?" "He is," Thomas replied, then hesitated. In all his years of service, he learned to read people quickly and accurately. There was something about this young woman that seemed different from the others, not desperate to succeed, not calculating advantages, but simply present in a way that suggested she was here for reasons beyond personal ambition. As they walked through the palace corridors, Elena's eyes took in the tapestries and artwork with genuine appreciation, but she didn't gawk or comment on the wealth displayed around her. Instead, she asked Thomas questions that surprised him. Has His Highness always lived in the palace? Does he know the names of the servants who tend these gardens? When was the last time he walked through the village below? By the time they reached the throne room, Thomas found himself genuinely curious about what this baker's daughter might say or do that could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. As he announced her arrival and stepped aside, he noticed that Prince Adrian sat forward slightly in his throne, his attention already caught by something indefinable about Elena's presence. Elena entered the vast throne room with the same calm composure she had shown in the courtyard. She approached the throne with respectful but not servile steps, carrying her simple bundle like it contained the crown jewels. When she reached the appropriate distance, she offered a curtsy that was proper without being elaborate, the greeting of someone who understood courtesy without needing to perform it. "Your Highness," she said, her voice clear and warm, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Adrian studied her face, searching for signs of the nervous calculation he had seen in every other suitor. Instead, he found eyes that looked at him with genuine curiosity, and something that might have been concern, not for her own chances of success, but for his well-being. It was such an unexpected expression that he felt momentarily off balance. "You are welcome here," he replied, then found himself adding, "though I confess I am curious what you hope to accomplish that others have not." Elena smiled then, and Adrian was struck by how natural and unforced it seemed. "Perhaps, Your Highness, the question is not what I hope to accomplish, but what you might be willing to discover about yourself if we approach this differently." For the first time in 7 days, Adrian felt a stirring of something that might have been genuine interest. Chapter 7. A Different Perspective. Adrian found himself leaning forward in his throne, genuinely intrigued for the first time in days. There was something about Elena's response that suggested she wasn't here to perform for him, but rather to engage with him in some way he couldn't yet understand. "Approach this differently?" he repeated, studying her face for clues about what she meant. "Every woman who has come before you has tried a different approach. What makes yours unique?" Elena considered the question thoughtfully, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening to something only she could hear. "Perhaps, Your Highness, because I'm not trying to give you something new. Instead, I wonder if we might look at what you already have, but from a direction you've never considered." "I assure you," Adrian said with a hint of his old weariness creeping back into his voice, "I have examined my possessions from every conceivable angle. They are beautiful, rare, valuable, and utterly meaningless to me." "Oh, but that's exactly what I mean," Elena said, her eyes brightening with something that looked almost like excitement. "You speak of examining your possessions, but what about the people who created them? What about the stories they carry? What about the hands that shaped them, and the dreams that inspired them?" Before Adrian could respond, Elena unwrapped her simple bundle and held up the loaf of bread. In the opulent throne room, surrounded by gold and marble and priceless art, it looked almost absurd, a humble object that belonged in a kitchen, not a palace. "This bread," she said, holding it gently in her palms, "is just flour and water and yeast, ingredients you could buy in any market. But would you like to know its real story?" Despite himself, Adrian found his curiosity genuinely piqued. "Please." Elena's voice took on a storyteller's cadence, warm and engaging. "The wheat grew in Farmer Henrik's field, you remember him? The old groundskeeper who I heard used to let you help in the palace gardens when you were small. He retired to a small plot outside the village, but he still brings me his best grain because my father once gave him bread during a hard winter when he had no coin to pay for it." Adrian's eyes widened slightly. He did remember Henrik, remembered dirt under his fingernails, and the satisfaction of pulling those tiny carrots from the earth. The memory stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. "The salt came from the coastal village where my cousin Maria lives," Elena continued. "She gathers it herself from tide pools, and she sent this particular batch along with a letter saying her youngest daughter took her first steps last month. The herbs are from my own garden basil and rosemary that I planted from seeds my mother saved before she died." As she spoke, the simple loaf began to transform in Adrian's perception. It was no longer just an object, but a web of connections. A story that linked together farmers and family members, past and present, effort and love and loss all kneaded together into something that sustained life. "Every morning when I bake," Elena said softly, "I think about all these people, all these stories. This bread carries their hopes and struggles and small triumphs, When someone breaks it and eats it, they're not just feeding their body, they're participating in this great chain of human connection that stretches back generations and forward into the future. Adrian stared at the loaf with new eyes, seeing not just bread but the network of relationships and history it represented. For the first time in months, he felt a stirring of something that might have been wonder. "But surely," he said, his voice uncertain, "this is just sentiment? A pretty story attached to something ordinary?" Elena smiled and extended the bread toward him. "Perhaps you'd like to see for yourself, but not here, in this formal room where everything is arranged for display. Would you be willing to come somewhere else with me? Somewhere we might see your world through different eyes?" Adrian hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time someone had invited him anywhere, rather than waiting for his commands or trying to entertain him in prescribed ways. The throne room had been his entire world for so long. A stage where others performed while he remained passive and unmoved. "Where?" he asked. "Your kitchen, Your Highness. Have you ever actually been to the place where your food is prepared? Do you know the names of the people who cook for you every day?" The question struck Adrian like a physical blow. He realized with sudden shame that he had no idea who prepared his elaborate meals, had never wondered about the hands that created the dishes he barely tasted. The kitchen was somewhere below the palace, a place he had probably passed 100 times without ever entering. "No," he admitted, feeling foolish. "I have never thought to visit the kitchens." "Then perhaps," Elena suggested gently, "that might be a place to start. Not to judge or inspect or make royal pronouncements, but simply to see, to meet the people whose work sustains your life every day, to understand what they do and why they take pride in it." Adrian found himself standing without conscious decision, drawn by something in Elena's voice that promised discovery rather than duty. For the first time since his proclamation, he felt genuinely curious about what might happen next. "Thomas," he called to his attendant, who had been waiting discreetly by the door. Could you guide us to the kitchen? I find myself wanting to see it." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise, but he bowed deeply. "Of course, Your Highness. It would be my honor." As they prepared to leave the throne room, Adrian realized that Elena had done something none of the other women had attempted. She had made him want to move, to act, to discover something new about his own world. She hadn't brought him gifts from outside his life, but had offered to show him depths within it that he had never noticed. "Elena," he said as they reached the doorway, using her name for the first time. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness." "Why do you care? What does it matter to you whether I find joy or remain as I am?" Elena paused, considering his question with the same thoughtfulness she had shown earlier. "Because, Your Highness, I have learned that there are two kinds of emptiness in this world. There's the emptiness that comes from having nothing, no food, no shelter, no hope for tomorrow. But there's also the emptiness that comes from having everything but losing the ability to see meaning in any of it. Both are forms of starvation, and both deserve compassion." Her words settled over Adrian like a gentle weight, and he found himself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, someone truly understood what ailed him. Not the symptoms, the boredom, the listlessness, the inability to feel pleasure, but the underlying condition itself. As they began their journey toward the kitchen, Adrian felt something he had almost forgotten how to recognize: anticipation for what he might discover about himself and his world through Elena's eyes. Chapter 8. The World Beyond. The journey to the kitchen took them through corridors Adrian had walked countless times but never truly seen. Elena moved beside him with quiet attention, occasionally pausing to examine a tapestry or ask Thomas about the history of a particular room. Her questions weren't those of someone trying to impress with knowledge, but of someone genuinely curious about the lives and stories that had shaped this place. "Thomas," she said as they passed a worn stone threshold. "This doorway looks much older than the rest. Was this part of the original castle?" Thomas's weathered face lit up with pleasure at being asked. "Indeed, miss. This was built by King Adrian's great-great-grandfather during the siege of 1847. The stones came from a quarry where my own grandfather worked as a young man. He used to tell me stories about hauling blocks like these up the mountain." Adrian stopped walking, struck by the realization that he had never known this history, had never thought to ask about the generations of people whose labor had created his home. In Elena's presence, even Thomas seemed more animated, more human than the efficient servant Adrian had always seen him as. As they descended the stone steps toward the kitchen levels, the air grew warmer and filled with rich aromas, fresh bread, simmering stews, herbs and spices that spoke of meals being prepared with care and attention. Adrian could hear voices ahead, laughter mixed with the sounds of chopping and stirring, and he felt a strange flutter of nervousness in his chest. "Your Highness," Thomas said softly as they approached the kitchen doors. "Shall I announce you?" "No," Adrian replied, surprising himself. I think I'd like to see them as they are, before they feel obligated to perform for royalty." Elena smiled at this response, and Adrian caught a glimpse of approval in her eyes that warmed him in an unexpected way. Through the partially open door, they could see into the bustling heart of the palace. The kitchen was enormous, with great hearths and long wooden tables where a dozen people worked in choreographed harmony. An older woman with flour-dusted hands was kneading dough while humming a folk tune, her movements rhythmic and sure. Two younger men were debating the proper seasoning for a sauce, their voices animated with professional pride. A girl barely out of childhood was carefully arranging vegetables in patterns that turned simple food into art. Adrian watched in fascination as Master Cook Bertram, a man he had never met, despite eating his food for years, tasted a soup and nodded with satisfaction before adding just a pinch more of some herb. There was something beautiful about the way they all worked together, each person contributing their skill to create something larger than themselves. "They take such care," Adrian murmured, almost to himself. "Of course they do," Elena said softly. "They're feeding people they care about. I heard Master Bertram has been cooking for your family since you were born. Did you know he created that honey cake recipe specifically for your 7th birthday because Thomas mentioned you liked sweet things?" Adrian's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that Cake had loved it so much that it had appeared at every birthday since, though somewhere along the way he had stopped noticing its presence on the table, stopped tasting the careful balance of flavors that had once delighted him. Elena pushed the door open gently, and they stepped into the warm, busy space. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused. Wooden spoons stopped stirring, and every face turned towards the doorway where Prince Adrian stood, looking uncertain and oddly vulnerable. Master Bertram, a robust man with kind eyes and hands permanently stained with the tools of his trade, was the first to recover from his surprise. He wiped his palms on his apron and offered a deep bow that was respectful without being servile. "Your Highness," he said, his voice carrying genuine pleasure rather than mere duty. "What an unexpected honor. Is there something wrong with your meals? Something we can improve?" "No," Adrian said quickly, then found himself struggling to explain why he was there. I realized I have never properly thanked you for your years of service. I have never even met you, though you have fed me every day of my life." The silence that followed was pregnant with surprise and something deeper, a recognition that this moment was somehow significant, beyond the mere courtesy of a royal visit. "Bertram," Elena said gently, "would you be willing to show His Highness how you prepare his meals? Not because anything is wrong, but because he's curious about the work itself, about what goes into nourishing someone day after day." Bertram's weathered face broke into a smile of genuine delight. "Oh, miss, I would be more than happy to. Your Highness, if you'd like to see—" He gestured toward his workstation, where the ingredients for the evening meal were laid out with military precision. What followed was a revelation for Adrian. Bertram explained not just what he was cooking, but why, how he balanced flavors to stimulate appetite, how he varied textures to create interest, how he chose ingredients based on the season and the prince's health, and even his moods, which Thomas apparently reported to the kitchen staff daily. "When Thomas mentions you've seemed particularly tired," Bertram explained as he demonstrated his technique for preparing a restorative broth, "I add more iron-rich herbs. When you've been studying late, I include foods that aid concentration. It's not just about feeding your body, Your Highness. It's about caring for your whole well-being." Adrian watched the cook's hands work, skilled, sure, generous in their movements. He began to understand that every meal he had barely tasted represented hours of thoughtful preparation, someone else's dedication to his welfare, care that he had received, but never acknowledged. "The honey cake," Adrian said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion he didn't entirely understand. "Elena told me you created that recipe for my 7th birthday." Bertram's smile grew even warmer. "Aye, that I did. Thomas said you had a sweet tooth, but that rich desserts made you feel poorly. Took me weeks to get the balance right. Sweet enough to delight a child, but light enough not to make you sick. I still make it the same way, every year." I had forgotten," Adrian admitted, shame coloring his voice. "I stopped really tasting it, stopped seeing it as anything more than just another dish on the table," Bertram finished kindly. "Oh, Your Highness, that's not your fault. When someone cares for you every day, it's easy to stop noticing the care itself. But that doesn't make it less real." Elena had remained quietly in the background during this exchange, but Adrian was acutely aware of her presence, of how her simple suggestion had opened this door to discovering people who had been invisible to him despite their constant service. One of the younger cooks, emboldened by the prince's obvious interest, stepped forward shyly. "Your Highness, if I may, we all take such pride in our work here, in knowing that what we create sustains your family. It means more than you might realize, having you take the time to see us, to understand what we do." Adrian looked around the kitchen at all the faces turned toward him, people of different ages and backgrounds united by their dedication to their craft and their care for his well-being. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely humbled by someone else's generosity rather than burdened by it. "Would you," he began hesitantly, then found his courage, "would you be willing to teach me? Not just to watch, but to actually help prepare something? I find myself curious about what it feels like to create sustenance with my own hands." The kitchen erupted in delighted surprise. Bertram practically glowed with pleasure as he gestured Adrian toward a workstation. "Nothing would make me happier, Your Highness. Perhaps we could start with something simple bread, maybe. There's something deeply satisfying about kneading dough, about feeling it come alive under your hands." Elena moved closer as Bertram began showing Adrian the basic techniques, flour already dusting the prince's fine clothes, as he attempted to mirror the master cook's movements. His first efforts were clumsy, his hands unused to such work, but there was something in his expression that hadn't been there in years, concentration born of genuine interest rather than duty. "It's harder than it looks," Adrian said, laughing softly, as his dough refused to cooperate with his inexperienced hands. "Everything worthwhile is," Bertram replied sagely. "But see how it's already beginning to respond? Bread teaches patience, Your Highness. It can't be rushed or forced. It needs time and attention and gentle persistence." As Adrian worked the dough, feeling it gradually transform under his hands from separate ingredients into something unified and alive, Elena watched his face carefully. She could see something awakening there, not just interest, but a kind of wonder at being part of creation rather than merely consuming what others created for him. For the first time since his childhood, Prince Adrian was learning what it meant to make something with his own hands, to contribute, rather than simply receive. And in Elena's quiet smile, he could see that this was exactly what she had hoped he might discover. Chapter 9. The Awakening. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, Adrian found himself completely absorbed in the simple act of kneading bread. His royal clothes were dusted with flour. His hands were sticky with dough. And for the first time in years, he had completely forgotten to be melancholy. The repetitive motion had become almost meditative, and he could feel the dough responding to his touch, growing smoother and more elastic with each fold and turn. "There," Bertram said with satisfaction, watching Adrian's improved technique. "You're beginning to feel it now, aren't you? How the dough tells you what it needs." Adrian paused in his kneading, suddenly aware of what the cook meant. He could sense the texture changing, could feel when the dough was ready for the next stage. It was a kind of communication he had never experienced before, not with words or gestures, but through touch and attention and patience. Yes," he said wonderingly. "It's almost like it's alive." "In a way, it is," Elena said softly from where she sat watching. "The yeast is working, transforming simple ingredients into something entirely new. It's one of the oldest forms of alchemy, taking the basic elements of survival and turning them into nourishment, comfort, even joy." As Adrian shaped the dough into loaves, his movements growing more confident, something extraordinary began to happen. The kitchen staff, initially awed by the prince's presence, gradually returned to their own work. But now they included him naturally in their conversations. They asked his opinion on seasonings, shared stories about their families, even gently teased him when he dropped flour on his boots. Young Sarah, the vegetable cook, showed him how to tell when onions were perfectly caramelized by their aroma alone. Marcus, the soup master, let him taste broths at different stages of development, teaching him to identify the moment when disparate flavors merged into harmony. With each small lesson, Adrian felt layers of isolation peeling away, replaced by something he was only beginning to recognize as genuine connection. "Your Highness," said Anna, an elderly woman who managed the herb garden, "would you like to see where we grow the seasonings for your meals? The garden is lovely this time of day, and I think you might enjoy understanding where your food truly begins." Adrian looked to Elena, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they followed Anna through a door he had never noticed, emerging into a walled garden that took his breath away. Row upon row of herbs and vegetables stretched before them, tended with the same care and attention he had witnessed in the kitchen. The air was rich with the scents of basil, rosemary, thyme, and dozens of other plants he couldn't name. "I had no idea this was here," Adrian breathed, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants heavy with fruit. "All these years, this was right here beneath my windows, and I never knew." Anna's weathered hands gently guided his as she showed him how to test a tomato for ripeness, how to pinch herbs to release their essential oils, how to read the health of plants in the color of their leaves. "This garden has fed your family for 3 generations, Your Highness. My mother tended these beds before me, and her mother before her. Each plant carries forward seeds and knowledge passed down through decades of careful cultivation." Elena watched as Adrian moved through the garden with growing wonder, touching leaves, smelling flowers, asking questions with the curiosity of a child discovering the world for the first time. When he found a patch of carrots, small and imperfect, like the ones he had pulled with old Henrik years ago, his eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "I remember," he whispered, brushing dirt from a tiny carrot that was no bigger than his thumb. "I remember how proud I felt, how these little vegetables seemed like the most precious things in the world, because I had helped them grow." "That feeling doesn't have to be just a memory," Elena said gently. "It can be your reality again, if you choose it." As the sun began to set, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber, Adrian found himself sitting on a simple wooden bench beside Elena, the small carrot still cradled in his palm. Around them, the sounds of the palace continued, servants finishing their daily tasks, guards changing shifts, the distant music of evening entertainment beginning in the great hall. But for the first time in years, Adrian didn't feel separate from it all. He felt part of the great web of lives and work that made his world possible. "Elena," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about seeing what I already have from a different direction." She turned to face him, her expression warm and encouraging. "What do you see now that you couldn't see before?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were discovering them as he said them. "I see that I have been surrounded by love my entire life, but I was looking for it in the wrong places," he said. "I thought love meant gifts and entertainment and being served, but real love it's Master Bertram creating a recipe just for me when I was 7 years old, and continuing to make it every year, even when I stopped noticing. It's Thomas paying attention to my moods and quietly ensuring I'm cared for in ways I never realized. It's Anna's mother and grandmother and Anna herself tending this garden through decades, nurturing the very plants that sustain my life." Elena nodded, her eyes bright with tears of her own. "And now that you can see it." "Now that I can see it," Adrian continued, his voice growing stronger, "I understand that joy isn't something I need to be given. It's something I need to participate in, to contribute to be part of, rather than separate from." He looked down at the small carrot in his hand, then up at Elena's face. "For years, I've been standing at the edge of my own life, watching it happen around me but never stepping into it. You've shown me how to step forward." As if to prove his point, Adrian stood and walked to a patch of freshly turned soil where Anna had been preparing to plant seeds for the winter herbs. Without asking permission, he knelt and began working the earth with his hands, feeling the satisfaction of preparing ground for new growth. Elena joined him, their hands working side by side in the rich soil, and for the first time in his adult life, Adrian experienced what it felt like to be fully present in his own existence. The emptiness that had plagued him for so long wasn't filled by some external force. It simply dissolved, replaced by engagement and connection and purpose. "I think," Adrian said as they worked together in the gathering dusk, "I may finally understand what happiness actually is." "What is it?" Elena asked softly. Adrian paused in his digging, dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction warm in his chest. "It's not a feeling someone else can give you," he said with quiet certainty. "It's what emerges when you stop waiting for your life to happen and start participating in the lives happening around you. It's what grows when you plant yourself fully in your own world instead of standing apart from it." Elena smiled, and in that smile Adrian saw not just approval, but something deeper: recognition, understanding, and perhaps the beginning of love. As the first stars appeared overhead, and the palace gardens settled into evening peace, Adrian felt truly alive for the first time in years, rooted at last in the rich soil of his own life. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. 6 months later, the palace courtyard overflowed with a celebration unlike any in the kingdom's history. Where previous royal weddings had been formal affairs, attended only by nobility and foreign dignitaries, Prince Adrian and Elena's wedding brought together people from every corner of the realm. Master Cook Bertram stood beside visiting dukes. Anna, from the herb garden, chatted with foreign ambassadors, and farmers who had known Elena since childhood shared tables with courtiers who had only recently discovered the joy of genuine conversation. Adrian stood at the altar in the palace gardens, but not in the manicured formal spaces where royal ceremonies traditionally took place. Instead, they had chosen Anna's herb garden, expanded and beautified for the occasion, where the air was sweet with the scent of growing things, and the evening light filtered through leaves that Adrian now tended with his own hands. As Elena approached through the garden paths, her simple wedding dress adorned with flowers she had grown herself, Adrian felt his heart swell with a contentment so complete it brought tears to his eyes. She carried not an elaborate bouquet, but a single loaf of bread decorated with herbs from their shared garden, a symbol of the sustenance, both physical and spiritual, they had discovered together. The king and queen, watching their son's face as Elena joined him at the altar, saw a transformation so complete they could hardly believe this radiant young man was the same hollow-eyed prince who had stood on his balcony just months before, searching desperately for something to make him feel alive. "My dear friends," Adrian said, addressing the gathered crowd with a voice strong and clear with purpose, "Elena taught me that joy is not something we can be given, but something we create together through our connections to each other and to the work that sustains our world." He turned to Elena, taking her hands in his hands that were no longer soft and unmarked, but calloused from honest work in gardens and kitchens, stained with the evidence of a life fully lived. "You showed me that I was not lacking anything," he said to her, his voice intimate despite the crowd around them, "but that I had simply forgotten how to see the abundance that surrounded me. You taught me that the cure for emptiness is not to be filled by others, but to pour oneself out in service and connection and love." Elena smiled up at him, her own eyes bright with tears of happiness. "And you taught me," she replied, "that sharing our gifts, whether they're loaves of bread or royal privileges, multiplies them beyond measure. Together, we've learned that the greatest luxury is not what we can possess, but what we can give and receive in the great exchange of human caring." As they spoke their vows in the fading light, surrounded by the people whose lives they had learned to treasure, something magical seemed to settle over the gathering. It was as if everyone present could feel the genuine love and purpose radiating from the couple, a contentment so real and deep that it invited others to examine their own lives for similar possibilities. Master Bertram, standing with his kitchen staff, wiped away tears as he watched the prince who had once barely tasted his food, now promised to help Elena establish teaching kitchens throughout the kingdom, where people could learn not just to cook, but to understand the connections between nourishment and community. Thomas, who had served the royal family for decades, felt his heart full as he heard Adrian announce their plans to transform unused palace rooms into workshops, where craftspeople could teach their skills to anyone who wished to learn, breaking down the barriers between servants and served. When the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, it was not a formal reception, but a true feast, in the most ancient sense, a sharing of food and stories and music that continued long into the night. Adrian and Elena moved through the crowd not as distant figures to be admired, but as friends and partners, equally comfortable speaking with visiting royalty and village children. As the evening wore on, Adrian found himself once again working alongside Bertram and the kitchen staff, this time helping to serve the feast to their guests. Elena was beside him, laughing as she balanced platters and remembered names and listened to stories from people she had known all her life, and others she was meeting for the first time. "Are you happy, Your Highness?" asked little Sarah from the kitchens, now brave enough to tease the prince she had watched transform from a distant figure into someone who felt like family. Adrian paused in his serving, looking around at the scene before him. His parents dancing with village elders, nobles learning folk songs from farmers, children playing games that crossed all boundaries of class and status. Elena caught his eye from across the courtyard and smiled. and he felt the now familiar warmth of complete contentment spreading through his chest. "Sarah," he said with a grin, "I don't think I even understood what happiness was until Elena taught me that it wasn't something to be pursued, but something to be lived. And yes, I am happier than I ever imagined possible." As the night deepened and the celebration continued, Adrian and Elena found themselves once again in the herb garden, where they had first worked the soil together. The wedding guests had gradually formed a circle around them, but instead of watching a performance, they were participating in something unprecedented, a royal celebration where everyone felt equally welcome, equally valued, equally part of the joy being celebrated. "Look what we've created together," Elena said softly, gesturing at the scene around them, not just the wedding, but the community of connection that had grown from their understanding of what it meant to truly live. Adrian took her hand and pulled her into the center of the garden, where they began to dance to music, played by musicians who were no longer performing for them, but celebrating with them. As other couples joined them, the distinction between royal and common, servant and served, dissolved entirely into the simple human joy of people who had discovered that the secret to happiness lay not in what they could accumulate, but in what they could share. Under a canopy of stars, surrounded by people whose lives they had learned to see and value, Prince Adrian and Elena began their new life together, not as ruler and subject, but as partners in the great work of building a world where everyone could discover the abundance that comes from genuine connection, meaningful work, and the courage to step fully into their own lives. The palace, once a beautiful prison, had become a true home. And Adrian, who had spent years searching desperately for something to make him feel alive, had learned the most important lesson of all: that life is not something that happens to us, but something we create together. One relationship, one act of service, one moment of genuine presence at a time. As they danced through the garden they had planted with their own hands, Elena and Adrian knew they would never again need to search for happiness. They had learned how to grow it themselves.